So last week, the Torah portion, Noah, was kind of a new beginning, as it were, especially after God wiped out most everything. So this Torah portion also presents a new beginning, of course, with Abraham, because it's going to be through Abraham that God calls forth a people called Israel, a nation that is called to be a light to all the rest of the nations. And so there's a mission that started with Adam. He faltered in that. It was handed off to Noah, and then from Noah it was passed on down to Abram, who becomes Abraham. Now, there is a tradition. I want to underscore that word. There is a tradition that Abraham was born in Ur of the Kasdim in the 1948th year after creation. In other words, in 1948. I've just always found that interesting, and particularly since I'm going to bring something out in just a little while. But that's a tradition, but it's kind of an interesting tradition, wouldn't you say? That the man that God called to raise up a nation that was going to be the people through whom he worked and ministered and called to other nations, that it was that he was born 1948 years into human history. But anyway, he's called to leave Ur, which is basically Babylon, and everything behind to follow God. And so we go to Genesis, or Bereshit, chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. Now the Lord had said to Avram, "Get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you, and I will make you a great nation. I will bless you, and I will make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. And in you all of the families of the earth shall be blessed." And so Abram departed as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. And Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And so as we begin, Abraham probably, certainly not more than the Messiah, but among those notables in Scripture, probably Abraham above and beyond everyone else his life is a template for those of us who follow after the Messiah, because in Messiah we are called the seed of not David, not Noah, not Isaiah, but the seed of Abraham, right? In Galatians chapter 3, what did Paul say? That if you are in Messiah, you are the seed of Abraham and heirs according to the promises that were given to Abraham. And so then his journeys, his trials, his triumphs, his failures, all of those things are to speak to us. We're to learn from those things, learn to what to try to emulate, learn those things that we're not to, learn from his mistakes. There is a belief in Judaism that the things that happened to the patriarchs, particularly Abraham, Isaac, and to Jacob, were portents for things that were going to happen to their descendants. In other words, if it happened to them in some form or fashion, we're going to have to live through it as well. It is a portent for the children. And so then everything that happened to them, we should learn from it. We should be inspired by it. We should be cautioned by it. But in the end, because it happened to them and God brought them through these things, it should also give us confidence that he is going to do the same for us. That is, if we remain faithful. So these lessons that we learn, particularly from Abraham, teach us that if we put our hopes in the Creator, in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, in the end, we're not going to be disappointed. That is not to say that we're not going to be put to the test. It's not to say we're not going to be disappointed in ourselves at times in certain situations. But in the end, if we put our trust and confidence in him, we're not going to be disappointed. So we understand that they had many trials, they had many triumphs. And so if we are of the mind that what happened to the patriarchs is going to in some way happen to us, then obviously we're going to have to endure many trials as well. The first trial that is recorded for Abraham is actually embedded in the words lech lecha. Go, leave, scram, get out of here, get out, that kind of a thing. Some people interpret it as to say, go for yourself or go see for yourself. Take some action. It's interesting, at least it is to me, the passage that we read here in verse 1, the version that I've read from says that the Lord had said to Abram, as if to suggest that the Lord has told him to do something, but maybe, like the rest of us, he has to think about this a little bit. Am I really hearing from you, or is this me? Maybe. But anyway, that's his first test, to go and leave everything that he's familiar with. Now, tradition teaches that Nimrod was persecuting him and all these different things that, that tradition hands down to us. But the Bible tells us that he needed to leave Babylon. God's telling him, get out, leave all these things behind, everything. Leave everything behind, and I'm going to take you to a place that I'm not going to tell you where it is just yet. I'm going to let you hear my voice and follow my leading. But it was needful for him to leave Babylon for his sake, for his benefit, and as we understand, for the benefit of his heirs. Now, I say that because at the time he received this instruction, who were his heirs? He didn't have any, did he? There were no heirs to benefit from his actions. But he still obeyed. He believed that God was leading him, and he obeyed. So the Bible teaches that when he first leaves Ur, he travels to Haran, and he's there for a little while, but then he has to move further away than that, which suggests to me that it's not just enough to come out of Babylon. We have to distance ourselves from what we were called out of. It's not enough to stop eating pork and put some tzitzit on your belt loop. Because Babylon is more of a mindset. It's a way of thinking. So I'm not suggesting that those things aren't important. Don't misunderstand me. But it's important that we leave that mindset behind. That we abandon all of those trappings that come with Babylon. It's kind of like the sinking ship scenario. I think I've shared this from time to time. Think of the Titanic. Think of all the people who perished on that. And if you were of a mind in that kind of a scenario to want to help people, to save people, chances are you're not going to be able to save many by standing on the slanting decks of the Titanic. How many people are you going to save? So what do you have to do? You have to get in the lifeboat. But if you get in the lifeboat and just hanging out by the ship, what's going to happen when the big ship goes down? It's going to suck you down with it. So what do you have to do? You get in the lifeboat and you put distance there. Okay. So not only do we have to come out of Babylon in certain things, but we have to distance ourselves from the mindset of Babylon, to separate ourselves from things that would suck us back in, so to speak. So that's why he's told not only to leave his country, but he's told to leave his kindred. He's told to leave his father's house. He's told to leave and put distance between him and those main influences that had been in his life up until this point of time. And if that is what God is requiring of him, it would seem to suggest that these associations, if he remained too close, they would impede what God was calling him to do. Now, I know that there are many people in this room and many people watching that following this path that you're on, that we're on, has put distance between you and a lot of family, a lot of loved ones. I understand that. Same is true for us. But looking at Abraham, I have to believe that as painful as some of those disassociations were, there must have been a reason that God had. Because I'll just say for me personally, there are some associations that I had to put distance there. Had I kept those connections very close, I probably wouldn't be standing here right now. Do you understand what I'm trying to say? Okay? Sometimes God requires us to separate from relationships, associations, that if we kept hold of them, they might impede what he is calling us to do. They might interfere with what he's calling us to do. So Abraham is someone who was called to abandon all, which is to say that he didn't want him to go back to Babylon. When he called them out of Egypt, he didn't want them to go back to Egypt. And so what he called us out of, it seems to say that he doesn't want us to go back to that, right? All right. Babylonian idolatry, Babylonian customs would have been detrimental to his spiritual maturity. And so he's asked to leave country, kin, and father's house. He's going to leave a country that he grew up in, everything that he was familiar with. He's going to be told to leave family, those people that he, I'm sure, loved in some way. He's going to be told to leave his very father's house. So let's take that and then look quickly at how that might affect us. I would think that in most cases, it would be very difficult for someone to leave their country and leave everything they're familiar with. Now, we have people here, and we have people watching out there who have done that. And I don't want to be too presumptuous here, but I would have to think that if God led somebody to leave their home country and come to another place, it had to be that there was purpose behind it, rather than just living a better life in a physical, temporal sense. That there had to be a mission behind that. There had to be a reason that God would uproot somebody out of their country and take them and plant them somewhere else. So that says to me that for you and I, we should not get too comfortable with certain environments and certain things, certain standard of living maybe. God will, at times we see, call his people to uproot and leave all of that behind because he has a better situation for them. Maybe with Abraham, he had already become to consider himself a stranger in a strange land. So over time, the nation, the country, the culture he was familiar with, maybe over time it wasn't so attractive to him anymore, and maybe that made it a little easier for him to heed the call. And when God said, I want you to leave, there come a time he was like, I'm ready. Maybe he was already considering himself to be a stranger in a strange land. How many people feel like that these days? Okay, all right. So if it happened to the patriarchs in some way, in some form or fashion, we should expect that it's going to happen to his descendants. Because in the end, what God was calling Abraham to do was to be set apart. And that is obviously what he's calling us to do. He was to separate from his relatives, from his closest relationships, his parents. And so, again, if he asked him to do that, there was something about those relationships that may have held him back. And I've thought about this many years when it comes to his father, Terah. How do you reconcile leaving your father's house and just basically separating yourself from all of these familial relationships? And how do you reconcile that with honor your father and mother? It seems a bit problematic, at least on the surface. But then if his father was indulging and engaging in certain activities and rituals and customs and things like that that were not conducive to what God called Abraham to be, then we could understand. He doesn't necessarily dishonor his father by putting distance between the two of them because he's honoring his Father in heaven. So just, something that has always kind of been, percolating in my brain. So it's very possible then that Terah's spiritual condition may have tainted Abraham. And that is again why he was told to put distance there. So if what happened to the patriarchs portends what is going to happen to the children, then perhaps there comes a day that you and I are going to be called to leave everything that we've been familiar with, everything that we're comfortable with, to uproot, so to speak. And not necessarily in a physical sense, maybe in a spiritual sense, maybe both. But nonetheless, we're going to be called to leave everything. By the way, he's already called us to do that. You did realize that, right? He's already called us to do that. It's just that we're in the process of walking that out. We've already given up a lot. We've abandoned this. We've disassociated with that. But more and more and more as this journey continues, we see that it's not a once and done. There's different seasons and different decisions that have to be made, different choices that have to be made. So again, Lech Lecha, this was the first great trial for Abraham. As I said earlier, for me personally and for my family, this was kind of a big test for us too. Lech lecha. Go. How am I going to do that? Go. How am I going to pay for it? Go. What am I going to do when I get there? Go. I mean, that was really the way it was. And I know that a lot of you can appreciate that. So it was his first test. For many of us, it was our test as well. And why was he called to leave everything behind? What was the goal? To be a source of blessing to many. That was the end result, to be a source of blessing to many, to the nations. But he was also, in being a source of blessing to the nations, he was also going to be the object of the nations, either blessing or cursing. In other words, kind of, it's centered on Abraham, and let's just go ahead and expand that to Abraham's seed. They would be the cause for people to choose sides. May I suggest to you that what is going on in the world right now, evil is being revealed, not to you, not to me. We've seen it a long time. But the world at large either couldn't, wouldn't discern what evil is, and now it's being revealed in such a way that no one will have an excuse. Everybody will see what evil is and what wickedness is, and nobody will have an excuse. Well, I didn't understand. It's the wheat and tare all over again. The wheat is planted in the field, then the enemy comes in, he sows the tares in the midst of the wheat, and they both spring up. And from what I understand, if you weren't a wheat farmer, if you walked out into the field and looked at it that very early stage, most of us would not be able to discern the difference between the wheat and the cheat. That's what a Kansas farmer told me they called it. But as it grows up and it begins to produce its fruit, that's when everybody knows. That's what's going on right now. There's no doubt in my mind. That's what's going on right now. Evil is being revealed in its most vulgar way for everybody to get to see. And look what's happening. People are choosing sides, aren't they? And guess what? The one who resides in heaven, he's watching. He's taking note of who's blessing and who's cursing. A choice that is not going to escape his attention. Now, Abraham was called to go to a land that I will show you. And here it was not specified as the land of Canaan. And so then his first trial, Lech Lecha, is kind of complicated by the fact that he's told to go somewhere and he doesn't know exactly where he's going. How many of you can identify with that? Right? Well, I know we're supposed to go, but I'm just not really sure. How many times have we heard this story? Well, we were in a state out west, we'll put it that way. And we were starting to feel like strangers in a strange land. So we felt like we had to get out of here. We knew it was coming, and then one day, this voice said, go. Where? Go. And so we ended up in Tennessee in this particular example. We didn't really know where we were going or why we were going or anything like that. And you know how this ends up. And I'm just looking out here at the audience right now. All right? So sometimes that testing is complicated by he doesn't tell us all the details. He doesn't tell us step 1, step 2, step 3, and on and on and on. And I think it is our human nature we're inclined to think that knowing all the steps and the outcome is going to lessen the hardship. Maybe. But then again, if we knew at the beginning all the things that he was going to call us to endure and have to overcome and have to deal with, it might have caused us to pause. I always think of Joseph in this regard. God gave him dreams. You're going to be powerful, influential. Your brothers are going to bow down to you. Your father is going to acknowledge how I'm using you. It's just that he left out the pit, the slavery, the prison. He didn't tell him all those things. He left that part out on purpose, apparently. Because if God told us everything in advance, and we want him to tell us everything in advance, I'm suggesting to you that if he did that, then there might be some of us who would be tempted to, maybe I'll stay in Seattle. Faith demands that we trust him and that we persevere through the hardships. As the writer of Hebrews says in Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to the place which he would receive as an inheritance. And he went out, not knowing where he was going. I just had a flashback. When we left Florida, all but one or two people said, "You're crazy." And the reason they said, "You're crazy," is because they said, "Well, what are you going to do when you get there?" "I don't know." "Where exactly are you going?" "I don't know." "You're crazy." Apparently, Abraham was crazy too. He went out not knowing where he was going, but by faith, he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and Jacob, the heirs with him of the same promise. The heirs with him of the same promise. And so this suggests that if we are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise, this is part of the process, is part of the journey, is dwelling in the land of promise as sojourners, strangers, among strange people anyway. But what was he waiting for? For the city which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. So I would suggest that Abraham's journeys, and we're just highlighting them today, they demonstrate his desire to draw closer to the Creator because he's looking for something that is in its, fruition, really even hasn't really happened yet. He's looking for the same thing that you and I are looking for. We're looking for the city that has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. We're not just talking about the earthly Jerusalem. We're talking about the new Jerusalem, right? So he was looking for the same thing that we're looking for. He was anticipating that and looking for that and believing for that. Faith is what motivated him in that regard, to draw closer to the Creator and have a willingness to leave all and to travel to a strange land, to be set apart even while he was living in that strange land, and to interact with the people, but not to be like the people, not to mingle with their ways. In fact, it seems to me that God took him out of a pagan culture and put him in another pagan culture. In fact, one that you might argue was worse than Babylon. And I say that because God didn't tell Moses and the Israelites to wipe out all the Babylonians, right? But when they come into the land of Canaan, what? Wipe them out. So he took him out of the fat and put him into the frying pan. How many of you ever felt like that? All right. So he didn't mingle with the culture that surrounded him. And it is here in this Torah portion that he is first called the Hebrew, Ha'ivri. Do we have that to show them in the Hebrew? So for all the Hebrew fans and students, Ha'ivri, the top line is the Hebrew. And it comes from that root word, avar. And avar means to cross over, to go onto the other side. And temporally and literally, he's coming from across the Jordan on one side, he's crossing over the Jordan into the land. But spiritually speaking, Abraham was on the other side compared to most. Abraham was hearing the voice of God to come out of Babylon. He's coming out of those ways and that mindset. I'm going to go to a land, I'm going to take you to a land, and you just walk by faith. So he's spiritually on the other side when compared to others, because he is a demonstration of what it means to pass from death to life, to come out of darkness into light. I think we've talked about this before, but Hebrew is not really an ethnic term as far as I'm concerned. Now, maybe that's what they meant, or let me rephrase that. That's what others have meant when they'll use that term Hebrew. But I don't think it's an ethnic term, first and foremost. Because there's nothing that says, before he was called Hebrew the first time, that he was ethnically Hebrew. He's called Hebrew not because of the form, because of the function. Hearing, leaving, crossing over. You understand what I mean? So I believe that those of us who have heard that call, who've come out of that other mindset and are striving in this journey to go to that place that God has for us, I believe we're all Hebrews. And I do not mean DNA, bloodlines, anything. I don't mean any of that. I mean, but it's a function. It's hearing God's voice. It's responding to God's voice. And so in that way, I believe that we're all Hebrew. So again, it's not so much an ethnic term as it is a description of those who obey God, those who follow his voice, those who go and then they do as he instructs, those who are coming out of darkness into his marvelous light. Not only is he called Ha'ivri, the Hebrew, but Abraham the Hebrew is the first one on record anyway that I can find who refers to the Almighty as Lord or Master in Hebrew. That is Adon. Adon. The possessive, personalized form of that is Adonai, right? My Lord. But Adon, he calls him Lord, he calls him Master. And if he's referring to the Almighty as Lord and Master, then that suggests that he, Abraham, is what? The Eved, the bondservant. He's the bondservant. And so, consequently, the ultimate bondservant, Yeshua, is going to point to Abraham as an example of what you and I are supposed to be, what we're supposed to do. In John chapter 8, he refers to the fact that Abraham's seed do the works of Abraham. If you're children of Abraham, then you'll do what Abraham did. You'll do the things he did. You'll act the way he did, which is to say that you and I should be motivated by faith first and foremost. I'm going to say this in context of what is going on in this world today. We should be motivated by faith first and foremost, not fear. We're told when stuff like this starts happening, it's not to cause us to shudder in fear, right? We're not supposed to be fearful. So keep that in mind in the days and the weeks and the months ahead, because I don't know. I hope I'm dead wrong in this. But this has all of the trappings of really blowing up into something pretty significant. And if we didn't know the Lord, pretty scary. And all you have to do is turn on the television or radio and listen to all the talking heads, and people are scared. People are freaking out. All right? And if they don't know the Lord, they have reason to. All right? But you and I, that's not how we're supposed to be. What we do should be motivated by faith. And then we obey him despite the trials that come along with this journey. And like Abraham, we have to be willing to do everything God calls us to do, to follow him, to be what he's called us to be. So I want to quickly consider some of the other works of Abraham that we need to be taking note of. Genesis chapter 12, verse 5 and 6. Then Abram took Sarai, or Sarah, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people whom they had acquired in Haran, and they departed to go to the land of Canaan. And so they came to the land of Canaan, and Avram passed through the land in the place of Shem or Shechem as far as the terebinth tree of Moreh, and the Canaanites were then in the land. And so looking at the works of Abraham, the deeds of Abraham, take note of the fact that there's a phrase in there that says that when they began to depart to Canaan, that they took the people whom they had acquired. Now, some commentators have interpreted this to mean that there were servants, there were dependents, these kinds of people that they picked up in Haran, which is possible. But Jewish commentators tend to interpret it to mean this, that they had made converts while they were staying in Haran. In other words, Avram, having heard this call from God to leave Babylon, he's in Haran for a while, and as he's interacting with the people there, he's actually teaching them and preaching to them about the one and only God that he is following, and he is making disciples along the way, which is very, very interesting to me. In fact, the term gotten here is literally made. The people he had made in Haran, which in my view anyway, kind of strengthens the interpretation that they were making disciples. So don't miss the point. He hadn't even gotten to Canaan yet, but he's already making disciples. And to make disciples requires something. I'm looking for a word here. Relationship. How many of you were here Wednesday night to hear Eddie, or you've gone back and listened to him, okay? Relationship, not religion. Relationship. Anybody can lead somebody in a quote-unquote sinner's prayer, but it's a different thing altogether to make disciples. We have to interact. We have to spend time with. We have to have relationships. So that infers that Abraham was doing just that. And of course, you and I know that that is something we are commanded to do. Matthew 28, verse 19. What's that word there that Yeshua uses? Go. But go. And what are we to go and do? Make disciples of all nations. Underscoring this idea that he's making disciples, not only on the way to the land, but also when he gets into the land. The text tells us that he enters the land and he journeys to Shechem, to the terebinth tree of Moreh. By the way, just as a footnote, centuries later, this is going to be the place where the Israelites come to first when they enter the land. Same area. But the terebinth of Moreh, there's an alternate translation that says the plain of Moreh. But what was the terebinth of Moreh? It was believed to be a tree that was sacred to the Canaanites, where they would gather and that these pagan oracles would be there and they would speak on behalf of their gods and their idols and things like that. And so if that's true, very interesting thing here, that Abraham goes there. By the way, the word Moreh, mem, vav, resh, he. Moreh, it means teacher. So something's being taught here. So is it possible then that God directs Abraham to go to this particular landmark, and while these other oracles are teaching of the false gods and the idols and these kinds of things, that God directs Abraham to go there and teach, well, I'm going to tell you about the one true God. Kind of like when Paul was in Athens and he went to Mars Hill and he's looking at all the different idols they've dedicated there, and there was this one that it said to the unknown God. And Paul brought that to their attention and he said, let me tell you about that one unknown God to you. I know him. All I'm trying to say is it's very interesting that Abraham was not just sitting around twiddling his thumbs. He was doing. He was sharing. Some people might even say he was evangelizing. But he was teaching of the one true God, and he was making disciples. He was being a light in the middle of all of that darkness. And why would God tell him to go, let's assume all that's true, why would God tell him to go to that particular tree and do that? Why would he do that? Anybody got an idea? I have an idea. God's already looking ahead about 400 and some odd years. When the children of Abraham are going to come into the land, and you know what's going to happen to all those Amorites? They're going to get wiped out. So you know what he was doing 4 centuries before? He had his man there to tell him the truth. Because at that time, the cup of the Amorites was not yet full. But there was coming a day when it would be. In other words, he was giving everybody, the most wicked of the wicked, an opportunity to hear the truth, to turn from falsehood and to embrace the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And to me, that's fascinating. Are y'all awake? Are you still there? All right. According to verse 7, this is the very first place in the land where God appeared to Abraham. And it is here that the Lord said to him, unto your seed will I give this land. It's a very important place. It's in that same area that we're talking about, where all these other things are going on. God appears to him and he says, I'm going to give this land to you and to your seed. And he said this to Abraham, even though the Canaanites were already living there. Hint, hint, wink, wink. In spite of the fact that the Canaanites had towns and cities and farms and vineyards and this and that and the other, the one who made all of that dirt and those mountains and the hills and the streams and the brooks, the one who created that and spoke it into existence, he's the one who said, Abraham, I'm giving this to you and to your seed. In fact, it doesn't matter that all these people are living here right now. Now, that kind of statement is not going to go over very well in this world today. But as far as I'm concerned, this world can take it up with the Creator. All right? That's what he said. He said this when the Canaanites were already in the land. And even so, Abraham is promised that his descendants would possess this land. And so to underscore this, that your seed is going to possess this land, he promised that his seed would be as numerous as the stars in heaven. And so I'll go ahead and get into this. I believe that alludes to you and me. We are his descendants. Maybe not flesh and blood, DNA, genealogically connected to Abraham. But if we are in Messiah, we are the seed of Abraham, and we are heirs according to the promise. We're part of the family if we've come into the family of God through Messiah Yeshua. So then, if we are the seed of Abraham, that promise of land was to you and to me as well. They're squawking over our land. Okay? Now I want to make certain this is very clear. That is not to suggest that we are going to dispossess our Jewish brethren. That is not what I'm saying. Okay? Now, there's things still to be worked out there as it relates to the Messiah. All right? But eventually, if we inherit the land, we're not going to be hanging out in Tennessee anymore. Okay? Now, when does this happen? I don't know. How do you think it's going to happen? I don't know. You can read the prophecies just as well as I can. I'm just saying that promise of land goes with the promise that he made to Abraham, and it comes down to you and to me as well. And I'm saying this in part because there's a lot of people in the body who, because of political expediency and what feels right and what feels good, are making some pretty stupid decisions right now as it relates to what God is doing in the earth. Are you hearing what I'm saying here? All right. I'll move on. You can't remove the land from the covenant, guys. So now, this promise came while he was in Shechem. And that town, that area, was actually, in time, was going to be deeded to Joseph. You know who Joseph is, right? Coat of many colors, the guy who wasn't actually living in the land. He looked like an Egyptian, spoke like an Egyptian, his identity was concealed from his brothers, that guy. This is the area of land, it was deeded to Joseph. He's buried near ancient Shechem or Shechem. They call it Nablus today. And today, Nablus is kind of, it's smack dab in that place that the world calls the West Bank. Some people call it occupied territory. But the bones of Joseph are there. I'm tempted to go off into something I don't need to do it right now. No. Maybe later. No, I'm not chicken. It's not that. We just don't have the time. But this is all happening in an area that later on, there are going to be people, there's going to be a world that says that does not belong to Abraham and to his seed. It's like God knew all this was going to happen. He said, I'll tell you what I'm going to do. I'm going to say it right here, just so there won't be any misunderstanding 4,500 years later. All right? So it says that in the Bible that Abram built an altar there because God appeared to him there, made that promise to him there. And here's something that's very interesting to me. Take it for what it's worth, but rabbinical commentators mention that when this happened, when God appeared to him, when he built the altar, when he said these things to him, that it was in the 2023rd year of creation. Things that make you go, huh. That's interesting, but my main point here is that the call of God and the promises of God They aren't just for one person. They are for that person. But they aren't just for that one person. There are long-term goals. There are long-term ramifications. The things that God said to Abram and Abraham thousands of years ago are still relevant to this day, and they affect you and me. They are for future generations. And so the things that God has said to us aren't just for me, aren't just for you. They are for future generations. They are for people that we have not yet met. So then, attaining that promise, coming into the fruition of that promise, requires determination. It requires faithfulness. It requires perseverance based on faith. It means not getting attached to anything or anyone other than God's perfect will for our lives. It also means, given the significance of the call, given the significance of the promise, because Abraham was to be a source of blessing to all nations. That was the reason he was called out, to be in another place. So considering the importance of all that, then know this: the adversary is going to do everything he can possibly pull out of his bag of tricks to undermine it, to derail it, to disrupt it, to destroy it. He's always done that. He's always going to do that. In the Torah portion, when God is making covenant with Abraham in Genesis chapter 15, remember, he's got the pieces all laid out, and who comes or what comes? These birds of prey, these vultures. And what are they there to do? They're there to come down on the carcasses, and Abraham has to chase them away. All right, well, you think, well, you got a bunch of dead flesh laying out there. That's what vultures do. Yeah, that's what vultures do. But this was a very important thing that God was connecting with Abraham. He's making a covenant with him. Point is, in the parable of the sower, Messiah talks about how the seed, the word goes out and it's sown. Some falls on the wayside, some falls in stony ground, some falls on among the weeds and the thorns and things like that, and then some falls on good ground. But what fell on the wayside, do you remember what he described as happening there? Birds came down. And he actually said that the birds are the ones who come to take away the word that was sown in their hearts. So the adversary is always going to try to disrupt what God has promised, what he's doing. He never fails to do that. So then, is it not always a certainty that with a call and with a promise comes a crisis? The gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. God doesn't change his mind. He doesn't quit on these things. He doesn't take back those things that he's given to us, because he always gives us what we need in order to do what he's called us to do. And we are called to do the works of Abraham, to do the same things that he was called to do. So in spite of the hardships, we've still got to hear that voice. We still have to respond to that voice. And along the way, when we come in contact with people, we're supposed to be making disciples. We're supposed to be witnesses of the resurrected Messiah. Doesn't matter what's going on in the world. Doesn't matter if World War III is breaking out. We're supposed to continue to do those things. I would say if World War III breaks out, that would kind of accentuate the need for us to continue, to be even more diligent to make disciples. For God so loved the world, right? In other words, not the time, how do I want to say this? I'll boldly go, all right? This is not the time for us to hunker down, in our caves and all those kinds of things. I'm not saying it's wrong to be prudent and plan and all those. I'm all for that. But you understand what I mean. This is not the time for us to retreat into our bunker. This is the time for us to advance against the kingdom of darkness. Because, go ahead. Because if, circle, highlight, if things continue down this road and blow up into something much larger than what it is right now, I guarantee you there are going to be people who would not listen to you yesterday who are going to be ready to listen to you. Because they've been watching. I want you to consider another attribute, the works of Abraham, as it were. He was a peacemaker. When the land would not support his herds and flocks and those of Lot's, he deferred to Lot's choice. So in striving to keep the peace and to avoid strife, he said, you choose. You go first. God's made the promises to me, but I'll let you go first. So he exemplifies there what Yeshua is highlighting in Matthew chapter 5, which is, blessed are the peacemakers. They will be called the sons of God. But also by attempting to avoid strife, it's another situation where he's separating himself just a little bit more. Lot's going to go his way, and Abraham's going to go his way. And so this setting ourselves apart is not just once and done. It's an ongoing process. Later on, he's going to have to send Hagar and Ishmael away. It was something that was very grievous to him. But he had to do it, and the Lord supported it. Because again, this journey is we're continually having to set ourselves apart from those things that God says, now it's time. So then, in order to be a source of blessing, difficult choices are always going to be facing us. It's going to be an ongoing process. And we will continue to have to make difficult choices, godly choices, just choices, righteous choices, those things that are in concert with God's will. But in its time and order, let's don't get ahead of him. Let's don't lag behind him. But let's just be able to hear when he says, Lech lecha. Okay? Let's be able to hear that. And these things have to happen if we are going to come into the fruition of everything God has called us to be, if we're going to thrive in the call of God. So then it would seem that there are times, in order to have peace, there must be separation. It's especially true when others have their eyes on things that are very deceptive. And I say that because when Lot looked at the well-watered cities of the plain and that area, and it looked like the Garden of Eden and all these kinds of things, what did he grab? He grabbed what glittered. But we know that everything that glitters is not gold, right? So he chose what was deceptive. It looked good, but there was a lot of evil there. And so in choosing the rich land, he embraced a corrupted culture. And he succumbed to this temptation. And that put him in a very bad position. What looks the best route isn't always the best route. Because in the end, that decision is going to mean or result in the destruction of most of his family. Grabbing what seemed to be advantageous cost him a lot. In contrast, Abraham's deferring to Lot's choice. And in so doing, he is demonstrating that he is considerate of others, even if he might suspect that others aren't really all that mature and those kinds of things. He's still being considerate. He's preferring his neighbor. And what he was left with was this less watered area, these rugged hills. But for Abraham, it was life. What seemed to be the harder road for God's man and his family was actually life. The hardest thing we're ever going to do in this life is follow Messiah. Every day. Every day. But it is life. Now, look at what happens after he and Lot separated. Genesis 14, verse 17, is where it begins. The Lord speaks to him and says, lift your eyes now and look from the place where you are, northward, southward, eastward, and westward. For all the land which you see, I give to you and your descendants forever. And I will make your descendants as the dust of the earth, so that if a man could number the dust of the earth, which he can't, then your descendants also could be numbered. So arise and walk in the land through its length and its width, for I give it to you. So there's that promise again that still resonates through the millennia. It stands. And the world is, a good part of the world anyway, is challenging that, standing in opposition to that, and is, I think, maneuvering right now and getting all their ducks in a row, which will eventually get shot down, but that's what they're doing right now. Exactly what Scripture says would happen. I'm not going to suggest that all these things are going to come to an ultimate fulfillment next week, next month, next year, next 10 years. I don't know. But we can see the signs, right? I mean, you can kind of hear it, right? You can kind of feel it. And so to some, that would go, oh, Lord, oh, no, woe is us. But actually, if we are following him, we should be starting to get a little excited. Why? Because this means that, yeah, bad stuff is coming, but somebody's coming behind all that bad stuff, right? In this portion, we learn that being a considerate and peaceable person, as Abraham was, doesn't mean that you can't be a warrior when you need to be. Abraham was willing to fight for those who were dear to him, even the ones who were less mature than he, even the ones who made stupid choices. He was willing to fight for them. Because in Genesis 14, a war breaks out between 4 Mesopotamian kings and the kings of the 5 cities of the plain. And of course, as we know, when this war broke out, Lot was in the wrong place at the wrong time, and he became a victim of this particular war. So here's the way it happened very quickly. It's described for you in the Scripture. But the 5 kings of the plain had served Chedorlaomer for 12 years, and then they rebelled. They rebelled. They refused to give tribute. And so this king Chedorlaomer, along with his allies, he attacked all the northern tribes there in the land who might be affiliated or might try to ally with the 5 kings. And then when all this was going on, the 5 kings, they got together and they went and attacked these 4 kings and their armies in the Dead Sea region. The 5 kings of the cities of the plain, they were defeated, they fled. Many of them fell into the slime pits and all the things around the Dead Sea area. They fled to the mountains, but they were defeated. And so these 4 kings and their armies, they come into the 5 cities of the plain and they sack them. They go in and they loot and steal, and they take all of their belongings, and they took a lot of hostages. One of them was Lot. The one who had decided to coexist with Sodom is the one who was taken captive. The invading kings are named in your Scripture. Amraphel, the king of Shinar. A lot of people, by the way, identified this with being Nimrod of Babylon. Arioch, the king of Elasar. Chedorlaomer, who was the king of Elam. And Tidal, the king of Goyim. Y'all know that word? Nations. Very interesting. May I suggest that this war in Genesis 14 has prophetic overtones? In fact, rabbinical commentaries suggest that this is a foreshadowing of the time in the future, at the day as we near the day of redemption, when the nations would come against Israel. And they believe that the 4 kings represents Babylon, Medo-Persia, the Greeks, and the Romans. Romans they identify with being Edom or Esau. And won't get into all of that so much. But they believe it is prophetic. In fact, it's interesting. I was just reading this past week. In Psalm 13, David, he says, how long, Lord, are you going to keep your distance from me? Or how long are you going to just forsake me? And then he says, how long are you going to hide your face from me? And how long am I going to be forced to kind of figure out what to do on my own? I'm paraphrasing. How long are you going to let your enemy or let my enemies lord over me? And so 4 times he says, how long? And commentators suggest that that is referring to these 4 exiles, and I won't get into all that, but it's also connected to these 4 kings. In other words, David's really speaking prophetically in terms of all the things that God's people have had to endure, being under the heel of their adversaries. How long are you going to let this happen? There's going to be 4. And so these 4 kings are kind of connected to it. Here's the only reason I'm bringing this up is the 4th king, the last king. He is the king of the nations. And so you've got people in the region kind of connecting with the nations. And what are they doing? They're coming into the land. Because at the end of days, here's what the prophets say, that the nations, the Goyim, are going to be assembled against Jerusalem. Zechariah 14, for I will gather all the nations to battle against Jerusalem. The city shall be taken, the houses rifled, and the women ravished. Half of the city shall go into captivity, but the remnant of the people shall not be cut off from the city. And some are going to be hostages, some are going to be spared. And when this happens, it says, then the Lord will go forth and fight against those nations as he fights in the day of battle. So here's something kind of interesting, at least to me, I want you to consider. That what we just read here in Zechariah 14 is very similar, in some ways anyhow, with the war that you read about in Genesis 14. Kind of interesting. The cities of the plain, specifically Sodom and Gomorrah, were ransacked. They were looted. People were taken captive, specifically Lot. And then what is the result of that? Then Abraham, when he hears about this, by the way, this is when he's called the Hebrew, then he goes and he fights with 318 people. My point here is that Abraham went to fight these four kings, including the king of the nations. And when he went and had this battle, a remnant was saved. A remnant was preserved. So, to make this connection, Bill, are you suggesting that Jerusalem is akin to the corrupt cities of the plain? Well, actually, in Revelation chapter 11, verse 8, do you know how John describes Jerusalem? Sodom and Egypt. So what's the point I'm trying to make? God is doing some things in this earth. He's going to shake everything, heaven and earth. And what is he doing? To see what's not worthy of standing and what's supposed to be standing, right? So he's looking. His eyes are scanning to and fro. Who's doing wickedness? Who's aligning themselves with wickedness? Who's coming against his purposes? He's taking note of all of this. And so as he's doing this, according to the Midrash, it says this. When you see the powers, and it's talking about Genesis 14. It's kind of taking Genesis 14 in that war and making this observation. When you see the powers fighting each other, look for the feet of the King Messiah. The proof is that in the days of Abraham, because these powers fought against each other, redemption came to him. Just keep your eyes on what's going on. It might all just disappear next week. I doubt it. But when these things happen, we need to be looking at what God's purpose in these things are. So things are quickly taking shape, I believe, that will propel the world into a time of chaos, confusion, warfare, upheaval. Is it going to happen next week? I don't know. Next month? I don't know. Next year? I don't know. But it will happen. And if it does, guess what? You and I got picked to be here. He picked you and picked me to be here at this time. Not 50 years ago, not 100 years ago, at this time. That means if he did that, it's with purpose. So when there's perplexity of nations, I think they're perplexed. When you see all these things happening and the powers of the heaven are being shaken, Messiah says that when you see all these things happening, know that your redemption is at hand. So, if that is the case, and I believe it is, that is all the more reason for you and I to make sure that we are in the right place at the right time, doing what we're supposed to be doing, that we're fully committed to functioning in our purpose, being everything he's called us to be where we're supposed to be, right? Which means we have to be a separate, set-apart people. And so let us learn, as we listen for the footsteps of the Messiah, to walk in the footsteps of Abraham through the trials and the triumphs, to be in the right place at the right time, to be functioning in our purpose. And that's going to require for us to endure trials, hardships. not really being certain of the next step sometimes, not being certain of where this all ends up. However, consider this, and I'll close. God gave favor to Abraham to endure the journey. He gave Abraham the favor to live in the midst of a very corrupt people and prosper. God gave favor and strength to Abraham to fight and to win the fight when it was necessary. And then eventually, when destruction did come upon the wicked, as in the cities of the plain, Abraham stood afar off and he was preserved. And so those who took what seemed to be to them the obvious, more advantageous route, leaving Abraham and his seed to take the more rugged, more difficult route. For them it was death. For him it was life. Because in Genesis 19, it said, Abraham went early in the morning to the place where he had stood before the Lord, and then he looked toward Sodom and Gomorrah, and toward all the land of the plain, and he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land which went up like the smoke of a furnace. And it came to pass, when God destroyed the cities of the plain, that God remembered Abraham. Which is to say, what? God was acting on his behalf, right? So, if all these things that are going on right now lead to other things that are much more dangerous than they are, much more explosive than they are, much more widespread than they are, I have to believe that if you and I, God's people, are where they're supposed to be, where he's led us, we're doing what we're supposed to be doing as he instructed us, fulfilling his purpose for our lives, that I have to believe that regardless of what happens in this world, he will remember us. If we're walking in his footsteps, he will remember us, and we'll be able to see these things from afar, knowing that he's got us covered. Amen? Amen.